this is lecture 7, and lecture 7 is going to be about the rise of oxygen on Earth. And something that we might take for granted here living on Earth is that we have all this oxygen in our atmosphere. And that oxygen is extremely, extremely important. I mean, not only is it important for us, as humans, because we breathe the stuff, but it's important for life. It has the rise of oxygen on Earth, turns out, we think, was fundamentally important to the rise of animal life and all complex life on Earth. And so what I'm going to do is talk about the history of the rise of oxygen on Earth, where that oxygen came from, and we are going to use that as sort of a segue into talking about the chemical, the complex chemistry that allows life like ours to exist. And again, we're talking about all of this stuff in the context of life elsewhere. So we want to understand how life came about on our planet, how complex life came about on our planet, so then we might be able to apply those rules and these understandings to other planets as we sort of begin to survey the galaxy. So, if you look at Venus, look at the atmosphere of Venus, even though Venus is very, very similar to Earth in many ways in terms of its mass and its relative distance to the sun. It's not that much different than distance from the sun, etc. Venus has basically 0 oxygen in its atmosphere. The Earth has 21% oxygen, as we've talked about before. And Mars, you go back to Mars again, almost no oxygen. So the question arises, why do we have so much oxygen? Does anyone know? Where does the oxygen on Earth come from? Yes?
Photosynthesis.
Say that again?
Photosynthesis.
Photosynthesis. What's photosynthesis?
Plants make air.
Sorry?
Plants make oxygen.
Plants make oxygen. Okay. That's right. So plants collect energy from the sun, and there's a chemical reaction, a very interesting and amazingly complex series of chemical reactions that allow plants to take energy from the sun and convert that into biomass, use it as its source of, plants use this solar energy as a source of energy to allow them to grow and thrive. And as a waste product of this reaction, they spit out oxygen. And so all of this oxygen that we have in the atmosphere comes from life. And in fact, it's the waste product of a certain type of life. So this is the type of photosynthesis that is particularly common on Earth, the kind of photosynthesis that's used in plants and blue-green algae. It's not the only kind of photosynthesis on Earth, but it's the kind that makes oxygen. More generally, photosynthesis is anything that extracts energy from sunlight to allow life to exist. And there are types of photosynthetic reactions that actually don't produce oxygen. But the one we're most familiar with, and we see green plants and algae, is this one right here. So basically what's going on is you have energy coming from the sun. It hits the plant, and specifically the plant uses chlorophyll to do this, absorbs energy from the sun. Oxygen is released as a waste product. The plant effectively breathes in carbon dioxide, and it combines this, uses the carbon from the carbon dioxide to create glucose, or a type of sugar that's used to then build the biomass of the plant. So the chemical equation, sort of the simplified version of the chemical equation that's what's going on is this. So you have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, okay? Carbon dioxide is a very rich gas in the early atmosphere, so we think it's been plentiful for a while, and these days it's not that much. But basically plants take the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, they combine that from water, which they might just get from the ground, for example, and then they use the energy of sunlight. So they take the energy of sunlight to break these bonds apart and create something new, to create this sugar, to create specifically glucose, plus a waste product, which is this oxygen. And if you add up all the different kinds of atoms, so if you take 6 carbon dioxide molecules and 6 water molecules, that produces 1 glucose molecule and 6 oxygen molecules as waste. All right. So the thing that the plants care about is making this glucose, because that's the biomass. That's what plants are made of. But the waste product here, as I mentioned before, is oxygen, right? So this is the waste product that plants have just to sort of exhale when they make this glucose to grow, right? But it's this oxygen that allows for animal respiration. And it turns out that respiration is an amazingly efficient way of converting chemical energy into useful energy that cells use to power themselves. And finally, another great thing about this oxygen is it eventually begins to accumulate in the atmosphere, and there are reactions with ultraviolet light in the atmosphere that creates ozone, which is O3. And that ozone then protects the land from ultraviolet radiation from the sun, which would otherwise fry those animals and plants on land. So oxygen actually does these two really important things for life on Earth, even though it's just a waste product. It's like the trash for plants to exist. Now, we haven't always had this much oxygen on our planet, and in fact, the amount of oxygen we have today has only been around, plus or minus about 500 million years. So for most of the history of the Earth, there really hasn't been very much oxygen at all. If you were to go back in time 1 billion years, okay, you would not be able to breathe. There's just not enough oxygen in the atmosphere. It would be a very, very different environment. In fact, if you went back in time 1 billion years, there'd be no animals at all. Because animals breathe. They respirate. So back at this time, there were no animals. There were nothing complex like animals. Respiration is really, really important for animals because respiration, as I mentioned before, is a particularly powerful way of extracting energy from chemical bonds. And it allows animals to do all the crazy things they do. Animals can do a lot more than plants can do. And that's because they have these incredibly efficient energy sources that they're tapping into, and they use oxygen to make that happen. So when you breathe, right, what's happening is you're breathing in oxygen, and that's allowing and that eventually that oxygen is circulated to your cells. And that oxygen facilitates breaking apart sugar molecules in your body that gives your cells energy to do stuff, right? So in order to live, you not only have to eat, but you also have to breathe. You take one or the other of those away, and you're going to die. Okay. So this is the history of oxygen content on Earth. And just to explain this is age in billions of years along this axis. And this is the atmospheric oxygen percentage. That means 100% is right here, okay? So that's where we are today. And so this is where we are today. And it's been fluctuating a bit, over the last 500 million years. But about 600 million years ago, it was much lower than it is now. It was down to only 10% or so, or even a few percent of what it is now. And then it dropped off to a very low percentage at early time. The very first life evolved right around here, but this first life did not produce oxygen. It was anaerobic. It wasn't utilizing oxygen in its energy production. And so there was no oxygen. And it also didn't rely on oxygen for its energy production. So that's back here. The first photosynthetic animal life happened right around here about 3 billion years ago. And it turns out that this was cyanobacteria, this single-celled organism, which is basically blue-green algae. So blue-green algae evolved on Earth and the oceans on Earth right around 3 billion years. And not too long after that, there was a huge spike in the oxygen content of the atmosphere. Only after that point did cells with nuclei evolve. So you have these initial types of life that basically don't even have nuclei in their cells. And I'll talk more about the different types of life, but very, very simple forms of life. Even first cells with nuclei didn't exist until after this point. And multicellular life started to evolve about 1 billion years ago. The first land animals and plants only started to exist about 500 million years ago, 600 million years ago or so, after this last spike in oxygen. Yeah?
Why did the oxygen content slow down? Is there not enough?
Why did this happen? This flat?
Yeah. Why did it just
Yeah, I'll talk about that in a bit. But basically, it was being absorbed by iron deposits, et cetera, for a very, very long time. So there's a lot of There are big sort of chunks of banded iron that we find in the ground today, and this is actually the primary place where we get our iron to do things on Earth. You know, that's what humans get their iron from. There's actually more oxygen locked up in iron, in these iron ore, than there is in the atmosphere. I think by like a factor of 10. You know, I have it in the slides. At least a factor of 10 or so. So a lot of it was being absorbed, sort of being bonded by iron and other sort of chemicals at this time. And eventually that was a sink of oxygen. And eventually that sink filled up, and it created this sort of second explosion. But it took a couple billion years for that to happen. And people are still trying to piece these things together. Yeah?
How did scientists figure all this out?
Yeah, I'll talk a bit about that. So yeah, but it's amazing that we know this. And so I'll talk a bit about that. One thing I just wanted to hit home, though, is this oxygen is important for complex life. And the reason why it's important for complex life, we mentioned this before, is that animals breathe oxygen. Okay? They get energy via cellular respiration. And this is the most efficient way to extract energy from chemical food, for the organic compounds that we eat. And this oxygen also increased in the, when it increased in the atmosphere, eventually a significant ozone layer developed. This ozone layer, again, protects animals and allows them to sort of exist and evolve and become more complex things. So oxygen has been really key in this whole development. Very quickly, how does this ozone develop? Just so in case you're wondering, what happens is you have an oxygen molecule, which is just O2, two oxygen atoms together. A UV photon hits that, UV light from the sun, breaks that apart, and then these individual oxygen atoms quickly bind up into O2 to create O3. So this is how this happens. And once this O3 exists, this ozone exists, this blocks high energy ultraviolet radiation from reaching the ground and frying stuff on the ground. So where did this oxygen come from? We've talked about this before. It comes from life, fundamentally from photosynthesis in plants and algae. And the first oxygen arose about 2.3 billion years ago, or a little bit more than that, from cyanobacteria called green algae. It's cyanobacteria is like the official name, and we call that stuff blue-green algae when we see it. So if people talk about algae blooms and blue-green algae in water, it's the same stuff. So how do we know all this oxygen was rare 3 billion years ago? And this was getting to your question. So one of the ways is we see this old stuff called banded iron formations. This one here is, in particular, is about 3.5 billion years old, which is dated by sort of radiometric dating. Now we know that you can only really form banded iron deposits like this in the absence of oxygen. Otherwise, the oxygen binds to it, and you just can't create this sort of streaks of iron like this. That is, it's effectively, iron is dissolved out in water and laid down at the bottom of riverbeds, for example. And this does not happen if you have an oxygen-rich atmosphere. That oxygen binds up with that iron and doesn't let it dissolve like that. Here's another example. This is pyrite, otherwise known as fool's gold. Okay? You see fool's gold in ancient riverbeds, again, that are billions of years old. Okay? This stuff does not form in environments with significant oxygen. And also, it's easily dissolved out of rocks if it's in an atmosphere that's oxygen-rich. So just the fact that you see this stuff, you know that you couldn't have chemically made this kind of stuff if you have an oxygen-rich atmosphere. So it's things like this that allow chemists and geologists to put together this picture that oxygen seemed to be pretty rare. You sort of build up this story. Now, you'll notice in this plot there's kind of two big events. There's a big one about 2.3 billion years ago, and there's another one about 600 million years ago. This one right here is called the Great Oxygenation Event. So this is a very big event for the history of life on Earth. And this, again, is this cyanobacteria photosynthesis that developed. Cyanobacteria evolved about 3 billion years ago. It was the first life on Earth to use oxygen-creating photosynthesis to derive its energy, to sort of capture solar energy. And it used the same kind of chlorophyll pigment, the same kind of pigment that traps this energy, I'll talk a bit about it, that we see in plants and algae today. Today, cyanobacteria is everywhere there's water on Earth, you see it. It's extremely common. It's arguably the most successful microorganism on Earth. It's the oldest, it's proliferated everywhere. You see it in wet rocks, you see it in lakes, you see it in the ocean, you even see it in Antarctica. This stuff is everywhere, and it's been around for a very, very long time. And it's arguably the most important thing in the history of the Earth that allowed it to be as sort of conducive to complex life as we see it today because of this oxygen production. So oxygen levels rose up to about 1% and remained there for about 1.5 billion years. And that's because it was basically, I was saying before, it was vacuumed up by mineral oxidation. Okay? So this banded iron formations sort of locked up this oxygen. And there's, I said earlier that it was 10 times, I misremembered that. There's about 20 times as much oxygen locked up in these kind of iron formations as there is in all the atmosphere of the Earth. So for a long time, you know, this photosynthesis was producing this oxygen, and it was just being absorbed by these chemical processes and not building up in the atmosphere. The rapid rise in atmospheric oxygen at about 600 million years ago basically occurred, we think, when these sinks filled up and there was another spike. And it was this last spike to get us to these high levels of oxygen that allowed this crazy explosion of animals and life to happen. So here's the history, right? Here's the great oxygenation event that happened that I was just talking about. Multicellular life happened only after that, and the first land and plant animals happened right here after this point. Now, after that, when the oxygen built up to this second level, something else happened. Now things went kind of crazy. There was so much oxygen in the atmosphere, it actually created a mass extinction for animal life that wasn't used to oxygen. There's a lot of animal life, sorry, not animal life. There was a lot of life that couldn't exist if there was a lot of oxygen around. It was basically poison gas to it. And so it caused a huge mass extinction when this went up like this. It also gave rise to an ice age. Okay, it created a big snowball Earth because of the way it affected greenhouse gases on Earth. And finally, because these niches had opened up, because so many types of life had died off during these great extinction events and these ice ages, it allowed for a great explosion in biodiversity because it created a great condition for animals that could respirate to get energy to start existing. Because this energy source was so powerful, you now have these incredibly complex things that can exist, that have incredibly sort of efficient ways of taking in food energy and using that energy to do stuff. And that's when you had this thing called the Cambrian Explosion happened, and life really went crazy and diversified on Earth. So this last rapid rise in oxygen created this great shock. It caused a mass extinction of anaerobic life. That is, the oxygen was poison to this type of life. So this oxygen rose up and all kinds of life just died out. It triggered a global ice age because oxygen began combining with methane in the atmosphere. There was a lot of methane in the atmosphere at the time, but basically what happened is oxygen tends to combine with methane to create carbon dioxide. Methane is an extremely, extremely powerful greenhouse gas. It's actually a more powerful greenhouse gas per molecule than carbon dioxide. Okay? So at the time, in the early Earth, there was all this methane in the atmosphere. And that was creating a great blanket over the Earth to keep it warm. But as soon as this oxygen started being spit into this methane, the methane then combined into carbon dioxide, which is a less efficient greenhouse gas, and suddenly the Earth cooled down a lot. And in fact, it got so cold that it created a global ice age, a snowball Earth, and so the whole Earth was covered in glaciers because of this. Something I should mention to sort of explain this, in the past, the sun was actually, the luminescence of the sun was lower. The sun is actually evolving over the last 4 billion years very slowly. And in the absence of greenhouse gases a couple billion years ago, the Earth would have been even colder than it is today, a lot colder. And so by removing this great blanket of greenhouse methane, because the oxygen came out, the Earth got really cold. Now that's important, right? Because that also tends to wipe out life on Earth and opens up new niches for new kinds of life to evolve. Finally, it created this niche for aerobic life, life that breathes oxygen and uses oxygen to respirate. This spurred an explosion in complex life because this oxygen respiration allows for faster, more powerful metabolisms, which is a metabolism that, the kind of metabolism that we have, the kind of, metabolism that all animals use. All right, are there questions about this? So if you look at the history of life on Earth, right, for the first, up until about 600 million years ago, life existed, but it was kind of simple, boring stuff. Like, not to sort of say that life is boring, but it was all this sort of one single cell stuff. When we think of life, we think of complex plants and we think of animals. Okay, that's all relatively recent, and it all corresponds to this boom in oxygen. Created this thing called the Cambrian Explosion. Pretty soon you've got plants begin to colonize land, animals climb up and get on land. Finally, at this point, you've got mammals, and then finally at the very end, this is us. In fact, Homo evolves way down here. Okay, so this is the so-called Cambrian Explosion. And just to sort of get a sense of a timeline here, 600 million years ago, you have the ocean. It has animals in it, finally. These animals have 2 eyes, legs, and shells. About 500 million years ago, you get first land plants and very simple land animals. The first land animals were like millipedes. 400 million years ago, you get vertebrates, amphibians, and insects. And finally, 250 million years ago, that's when the dinosaurs arise. You start getting these big, big things. At 65 million years ago, there was a catastrophic extinction that killed off the dinosaurs, and that triggered a diversification in mammals, okay, which eventually gives rise to us. The first proto-humans then arose about 2 million years ago, and the first modern humans, Homo sapiens, sapien, is about 150,000 years ago. So again, it should be pretty clear that we're very, very recent in this history. This is just up there. You can look at it on the slides online to give you a sense of all the different things that are happening. But after about 600 million years ago, the oxygen is rising to present levels. And there's some evidence that was actually fluctuating like this over the last 500 million years. Okay. So again, we've talked about this before. I just want to remind ourselves. So this is why photosynthesis is so important, right? Photosynthesis is really important, not just because it allows animals to exist, but because because it gave rise to this great explosion in complexity that we see. And as far as we can tell, it's the only thing that gave rise to this great complexity in life. Okay, this great complexity in animal life. Which at some level, when we talk about life in the universe, right, if we want to go find life in the universe, of course we'd be very happy if we were to discover bacteria on another planet or on Mars or something like that. But, in the back of your mind, everyone's really wanting to see, look, are there dinosaurs on that planet? Like, what's going on that? That's what you want to see, right? You want some, like, kind of sci-fi kind of movie. But as far as we can tell, this only happened on our planet after billions of years because of this. Okay, so photosynthesis is doing this, taking carbon dioxide and water, adding energy, making sugar and oxygen. This oxygen is the waste product, but it's the thing that allows animal respiration. Now let's talk a bit more about respiration. What is respiration? Okay, respiration basically is a chemical process that allows you to extract energy from organic compounds. Organic compounds basically just means they're made of carbon. They have carbon as a basis. What happens is you have some kind of compound, say some kind of sugar, that changes into some other kind of compound. And when that transition happens, it releases some energy. And that energy that's released is what powers the cell. Okay? So in our cells, what we do is we breathe in oxygen. Okay? Our lungs then take the oxygen out of that air, run it through the bloodstream, so then it can be combined with glucose to basically charge up the batteries of the cells. And as a waste product, we breathe out carbon dioxide. Now, just to sort of as an aside, there's actually two types of respiration. There's some so-called aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. Aerobic, and again, respiration just means you take energy from a chemical compound. Now, the kind we use is called aerobic because it requires oxygen, and this oxygen respiration releases lots of energy. It's a very efficient way of extracting energy from these chemical compounds, and it's what allows animals to be so powerful. Anaerobic respiration is weaker, okay? It doesn't use oxygen in the process, but you're still extracting a little bit of energy from that chemical compound. Okay. Now, I've shown you this equation before, but I just want to compare this to the one for respiration. And the amazing thing is that the basic equation for photosynthesis is the reverse of the basic equation for respiration. So let's go through photosynthesis one more time. You take energy from light, you add that to carbon dioxide from the air and water, and you produce sugar, this glucose molecule, and then the waste product of carbon dioxide, of oxygen. What animals do is they eat this stuff, okay? See this same sugar that makes plants? If an animal eats a plant, it's effectively getting this back, okay? Then it takes carbon dioxide from the air, this is a respiration process, turns that into waste carbon dioxide and water and energy. And this is the energy that powers the cells. Okay? Look at the waste product, right? It's oxygen. That's the same oxygen we breathe. The waste product from respiration is the carbon dioxide that plants use to create the sugar that we eat. Yeah?
What are plants getting out of this?
They're getting this to grow. This is what plants are made of. So they start off as a seed. The seed has almost nothing in it. And they grow, right? And this is how they get bigger.
Like body.
Yeah, it's biomass. It builds the body of the plant. It's it. Yeah. And it also provides the energy that allows the plant to put the cells together, you know, sort of these kinds of, but basically this is what it is.
So do plants also eat that?
No, so the plants get their energy, the plants get their carbon. So basically what you want to ask is where do you get your energy and where do you get your carbon? Okay, you need energy to like put cells together and build new cells and grow. Okay, and plants get their energy directly from sunlight. They get their carbon to make organic stuff out of directly from the atmosphere, from the carbon dioxide. And so what they do is they take this energy, okay, it allows the plant to grow and it allows it to get bigger. This is what the plant is, okay? And then it just spits out this oxygen. What we do is we have to eat to get our carbon. So we eat stuff. And fundamentally, we're just, our body, you know, we don't eat only glucose. But no matter what we eat, our bodies break it down into this eventually. Then you breathe in oxygen from the air to produce energy. So what we get out of it is energy. And the plants are primarily just getting bigger. Okay? But we use this energy plus the carbon that we eat to grow. Okay? Does that make sense? But the amazing thing is that it's this symbiosis, right? Because all of this stuff built up in the atmosphere, nature found a way to then say, hey, there's all this stuff sitting around in the atmosphere. Boy, if I could figure out some way to utilize this stuff in some way to create other kinds of life, wouldn't that be great? And because there's these tremendous evolutionary forces to make this happen, it did. And it happened in animals. Does that make sense? But the important thing is this energy, right, from the sun, that's the same energy that's here, effectively, right? So when we're eating food, okay, and breaking these things down from breathing, we eat some food, we breathe, we get some energy to do stuff. That energy fundamentally comes from where? Yes, the sun. Right, the sun. Does that make sense? So all life on Earth, not all life on Earth, most life on Earth is effectively solar powered. Plants, cyanobacteria, all that stuff gets its energy directly from the sun. But animals that eat plants, okay, are also getting their energy fundamentally from the sun. And when we eat animals and plants, we're also getting our energy from the sun. Does that make sense? So it's kind of crazy that photosynthesis lets animals harvest the solar power, right? That's what we're doing. We're harvesting solar power when we eat. And that's how we power ourselves. Moreover, you know, what else do we use energy for on Earth? What else do you use energy for besides just walking around and living your life? Like, what do you individually use energy? How do you use energy in your life? Any thoughts? Anyone know? Yes?
Mostly every process requires energy.
Sorry, say what?
Most of the processes that your body does require energy.
Yes, your body requires energy to do stuff. But think outside your body. Like you today. How were you using most of the energy you used today? What was it? What were you doing today that used energy?
To walk from the parking structure here.
Yes, you as an individual walk from the parking structure here, but how did you get to the parking structure? Did it take energy to drive? Yes. And what's driving your car? What's making your car go?
Energy.
Right, but what kind of energy? Fuel. And what's the fuel made out of? Yes, it's oil. Right? It's fossil fuels. Everybody with a laptop, okay? You've got a battery in that laptop. How did you charge that battery? You plugged it into the wall. How did you get electricity out of the wall? Okay, the nuclear power plant that we used to get some energy from has been shut down, okay? Primarily, we're getting a lot of our energy, although not entirely. We're getting a lot of energy from fossil fuel burning, okay? And a little bit from direct solar. All that's solar, actually. Okay, so fossil fuels, the fossil fuels we burn, okay, to power our civilization. What is that, right? It's called fossil fuels for a reason, okay? Coal, oil, and natural gas are all just fossilized remains of dead plants. Those dead plants are made of biomass, which was constructed via photosynthesis. When we burn coal, okay, that's a combustion event. You're breaking bonds. You're releasing that energy. Initially, those bonds were created via energy from the sun. So when you burn coal or oil or anything like that, you are releasing the stored solar power that ancient plants captured. Okay? Does that make sense? So that's why our whole society is solar powered. Everything. Now, it's not true for nuclear power. That's not solar power, so direct nuclear power. The sun is nuclear powered, by the way, fusion reactions. So it's all, but fundamentally, you get so much stuff from the sun. And when we break apart those fossil fuels, right, and release that carbon dioxide, where did that carbon dioxide come from? Initially, came from the atmosphere. The carbon that was all that carbon dioxide that used to be in the atmosphere that was breathed up by those plants that subsequently died and had been sort of holding on to that carbon dioxide for a very long time. Now when we burn it, we let it back out. Now, so as we were talking about before, okay, you were saying, look, everything your body does requires energy. When I walk from the parking structure to this room, I needed some energy to do that. When a plant grows, that takes some energy, right? Life requires energy. Without energy, you can't do anything. So fundamentally, maybe the most basic thing you need to have life is energy. Okay? So talk to me about what energy is. I just flashed it. But talk to me about what energy is. What is energy? Talk to me about it. What is it? We've just been talking about it for like an hour. Does anyone know what I've been talking about? Yeah. The capacity to do work. Very good. What does that mean? What's work? Remember? You would think of work as anything that you have to like push or pull to make happen. Okay? The capacity, work is applying a force through a distance, right? So it takes some work for me to pick something heavy up off the ground and put it up over my head. That is work. Literally, that's work. If I push on a heavy stone, okay, across the floor, I'm doing work. Anything to sort of move things that have some mass, that have some resistance to motion is work, okay? So moving stuff around, all that's what work is. And energy is the capacity to do that work. It's sort of like this, in essence, something that allows you to do something else. And the crazy thing about energy is that it can be stored in many different ways. Okay? There's energy locked in sunlight. There's energy that's chemical energy that can be stored in coal. There's caloric energy for us to use when we eat it, right? That allows us to do stuff. So energy is this kind of interesting thing that can be moved from one kind of energy to another. So for example, coal has locked up chemical energy, this whole fossil fuel that I was talking about. But if you take that coal and you burn it, say under a vat of water to make steam, that sort of creates a thermal energy. That thermal energy is moved into the motions of the water molecules that eventually evaporate. They move up, they might turn a turbine, or say they might turn a piston. That piston allows a train to move. And so when you take a train and you power it by a coal-powered train, what you're doing is you're taking the chemical energy locked in that coal and you're turning it into the kinetic energy of that train, the energy of motion that keeps that train going. And so much of modern society is you have one energy source, you put it here, you use it for something else, you use it for something else, right? So when you charge up your laptop battery, you're carrying that energy around that allows you to do stuff. Now, let's back way up and think about what life is doing, right? What life is doing is it's figured out a way, okay, there's energy coming from the sun via photons. Life has figured out a way to capture that energy and do something with it. That's kind of amazing that it's, you know, there's light coming at us all the time from the sun. Only very recently have we figured out easy ways to capture that energy directly from the sunlight and do something with it. But life figured out how to do this. But at much simpler analogies, let's think about energy in an even simpler way. If you've got a ball that's just falling down to the ground, that ball has energy. It has energy of motion called kinetic energy. Right? Now imagine you position a spring underneath that ball. And the ball hits the spring. Now when that happens, okay, the ball stops moving. And when it stops moving, it no longer has energy of motion. It no longer has kinetic energy. All of that kinetic energy that the ball had has been transferred into something else that's called, does anyone know what that's called? Potential energy. So there's energy locked in this spring. That's potential energy. It has some potential now to do some work on something once that spring has been compressed. Now, if you don't do anything else to this spring, what's going to happen to the ball? Someone tell me what's going to happen next. The ball came down and hit the spring. Yeah. It's going to bounce right back up. Boom. If this is a perfectly conserving interaction, that is, if there's no energy loss because of heat or friction, the ball will be moving back up just as fast as it hit the spring initially. Okay, so you had energy from the falling ball. It gets locked in potential energy of the spring, and then that pushes the ball back up. Okay? Now let's say you've got a ball falling with kinetic energy, and you think to yourself, boy, there's a lot of energy. You know, let's just imagine you're in some weird place with just balls are falling from the ceiling, like bowling balls or something. Like, there's a lot of energy in these bowling balls that are falling down. I want to do something with that energy. How can I capture that energy and do something with it? Well, let's imagine you go back with your spring, but then you create a little latch at the bottom of your spring that you jerry-rig so that when this thing hits, this latch springs up. So when it hits, it compresses, but then the latch comes up and stops that spring. And now you've caught that spring, you've captured its potential energy. The ball falls off, but now you've locked that energy that ball used to have you've now captured it in that spring. And you can do stuff with it now, okay? And in fact, if it takes less energy to flip this latch off than you get when the spring unloads, you've got a battery. And with this battery, you can do stuff. So a battery is just a stored source of energy. So now I can take it, I can put it behind a car, and I can fire that car off. Okay? The amazing thing is, nature has figured out how to do this. And as long as it takes less energy to undo this latch, you've got a charged up battery every time this happens. So you can imagine if you had all kinds of balls falling, which might be analogous to photons coming from the sun, you just have springs all over your world, and they get latched up, and now they're locked and loaded and ready to go, and you can do stuff. Charged battery, uncharged battery. And then you just recharge it again by letting another ball hit it. The way nature figured out how to do this is with kind of a complicated molecule that's called adenosine diphosphate, and then another one that's called adenosine triphosphate. Now this molecule is like the uncharged battery, okay? The spring unloaded. And this molecule is like the spring fully loaded. Okay, so this is called ADP, this is called ATP. Now the important thing is there's this kind of adenosine thing over here, sort of a complex molecule, and it's got two phosphates here on the end, and there's a third phosphate that if you add it to it, it actually charges the battery. It sort of coils the spring. You can actually think of it as sort of coiling up a spring. All life on Earth uses the same battery. Plants, basic cells, animals, fish, whatever, you name it. All life on Earth uses this battery. So the same molecules that are used in the cells of cyanobacteria are used in your cells, effectively to have a battery to do something with. Now, if that doesn't tell you that there's some kind of common ancestor for all life on Earth, I don't know what will, right? We all use exactly the same battery. Now, how does this work? Let's think about it. So, here's this adenosine thing. I'm not going to talk to you in detail about what this is. This would be like a whole thing you would do in a biology class. And then you have this triphosphate here. This is an energetic bond. And when you break that bond, okay, that's like releasing the spring, energy comes out. And so you break off that phosphate, that releases energy. And so you have a charged battery and an uncharged battery. And effectively, life on Earth has figured out a way to charge that battery and uncharge that battery. Plants charge that battery basically with solar energy. And animals charge that battery basically with chemical energy from stuff that they eat. But it's still the same battery. So what happens with photosynthesis is there are these things called chloroplasts that you can think of as little solar energy factories. They live in plants and algae cells. Now what you have is you have chlorophyll, okay, we'll talk a bit about, that captures red and blue sunlight and then stores that energy in ATP and then another kind of molecule that I'll talk about later. They then use the energy that's locked up in ATP to make sugars, okay, and then expel carbon dioxide, and this is in detail how the process works. So I want to talk a little bit about the process, and you're going to do a rocket mix module on this that'll allow you to dig deeper into this. And the reason why I want to talk to you about it is it's amazingly complex. It's incredible how complex this is. And it's sort of it's the basis of sort of all of the oxygen on Earth and all these so many important things on Earth. So there are these pigments, these light-sensitive pigments in plants that capture light at very specific wavelengths. And specifically, different types of chlorophyll that you'll see, if you look at the wavelength of light coming in and how that chlorophyll interacts with the light, this is the absorption of that light. And where these lines are high, that's where the light is absorbed. And where the lines are low, that means that's where the light is reflected. Okay? What color are plants? Green. Why are they green? Because they reflect light. They reflect the green light. Okay? So plants actually absorb purple and blue, and they absorb very long wavelength light, the red light, but they reflect the green light. So when photosynthesis is operating in these plants, they're taking the blue light and the purple light, they're taking the red light, and they don't care about the green light. And so they let that green light come back out at us. And so we see plants, we see all this green, but that's because they're gobbling up all those photons that are purple and red to do their business with. So what colors work best for photosynthesis? I sort of gave you that answer already. It's purple and blue. And why are plants green? And that's because they reflect that green. Now, just an aside, because we're going to come back to this stuff later, we care about this kind of stuff. Our sun emits a lot of light between purple and red. Okay? That's the light it spits out. But not all stars do that. Okay? The hotter the star, the more it'll emit more blue light and less red light. And the cooler the star, the more it will emit red light rather than blue. So if you had a planet around a cool star, it's not going to have photosynthesis that works this way because there's no light down here coming out at all. So these are important things to keep in mind because you get locked into how photosynthesis works on Earth and you have to think, well, boy, how would this work on another planet around a different kind of star? Okay. So how does this actually work in detail? And we'll talk more about this a little bit later, but and you'll get into this a bit more in your rocket mix module. But basically what happens, you've got the sun's spitting out energy via light, and that's interacting with something called a chloroplast. And this chloroplast is the thing that uses this ADP, ATP battery cycle to harness energy and make stuff happen. Okay? So, effectively what happens is the light comes in, there's a light reaction that's basically water and light that produces the oxygen. That charges up the ATP battery, and then the charged up AT battery is what combines with the carbon dioxide to produce this sugar. So it's actually much, more complex in this simplified equation because there's actually two kinds of things going on to both produce the oxygen waste and then produce the sugar. There's sort of two important steps that kind of go between. But one way to think about it is light comes in, splits the water, creates this oxygen, and that charges up the ATP battery. The ATP battery unloads through something called the Calvin cycle, combines with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and produces the sugar, and then you have an uncharged battery, and you do this loop. It's not quite this simple. There's some even more complex thing going on in here, but basically this is what's happening. Energy comes in from the light. That energy is captured from the uncharged battery to a charged battery. The charged battery then is the thing that helps produce the sugar. And then you have an empty battery, which you just charge again with the light. And you just keep going like this. And that's all done by these little chloroplasts, right? So if we could build macroscopic chloroplasts, these would be great because they're just little solar energy, power plants that are just charging batteries, right? So, there's your Tesla battery, put it in your car, drive it around, come back to your solar power plant, charge it up again, drive it around, right? So it's amazing that, life does this. Life has figured out how to do this. So that again, it's a bit more complicated. You'll learn about this in the rocket mix module. So I hope that I've convinced you, right, that it's sort of amazing. I mean, even when you think about what simple life does, okay? Simple life is just little cells, they might divide, that kind of thing. It's frankly mesmerizing how complex this organic chemistry is that allows this life to exist. Much less animals, right, that are just doing all of this complex stuff. And one thing to ask is, how is it, what is the main thing that facilitates all this complex activity, right? How do you just take random atoms and put them together and allow, build up something that acts as a battery? It's kind of amazing. Well, the place where all this starts is carbon. So you often hear that we are carbon-based life forms, right? So people who are fans of science fiction will hear the term carbon-based life form a lot. Okay, but the only kind of life form that we know about is carbon-based. There are ideas that there might be another kind of life, for example, that might be silicon-based, and that's because if you look at carbon on the periodic table, silicon's right beneath it, and so we expect it to have similar binding properties as carbon. So you can imagine building your biosphere out of silicon-based molecules that were also complex. But, if you look at the Earth, there's a heck of a lot of silicon. There's a lot of silicates on Earth, and yet life arose as a carbon-based life. So it's, there's not a lot of evidence that you would get silicon-based life, but whatever. Fundamentally, though, we are carbon-based life. And one of the questions is why? Why is carbon so special? Someone had their hand up. Did you have a question, or are you okay? All right. Now, oxygen is the most abundant element in life by mass, okay? If you just look at, for example, what we're made of, we are mostly oxygen. But that oxygen is all in water, okay? We don't really do anything with that oxygen other than the water acts as sort of the solvent that allows life to flow and exist. The thing that's really making the life happen and do interesting things is the carbon. Why? What's so special about carbon? Well, carbon, it turns out, is an extremely versatile element that allows all kinds of crazy and complex bonds so you can build complicated things, right? It's basically like, if you ever played with Tinker Toys, it's like a really cool intermediate piece in a Tinker Toy that you always build stuff out of, or something like that, right? It's something that's just really nice because you can build lots of stuff off of it. It's a great sort of building, base thing to build off of. Now, what is carbon, right? The nucleus of carbon has 6 protons and 6 neutrons, so therefore, to keep the thing neutral, you get 6 electrons, all right? But the thing about the way electrons can sit in shells around atoms is that in this very first shell, you can only have 2 electrons, but in the shell after that, you can have, in principle, you could have a total of 8 without breaking anything. Now, carbon, to stay neutral, just has 4, but you can shove on other things into it that have 1 electron sticking out. You can shove a 1 electron thing here, and another one there, and another one there, and another one there, and the thing fits together like holes in a Tinker Toy thing. So it's got like 4 holes where you can stick, other pegs, and those pegs are like electrons that lock in. Okay? So because you have 4 so-called valence electrons are available to stick stuff in, that allows a vast array of things you can build out of this carbon. So in principle, the outer shell can hold up to 8 electrons, and you can lots of options about how you can build bonds around this carbon. Okay? So, for example, here's carbon with some hydrogen stuck in it. Okay? Each one's got a little electron sticking in to create this bond. Okay? You can also arrange huge chains, okay, with complex branching coming out, or rings. You can do rings of carbon, okay? So that's cool. You can build long networks of carbon molecules, very, very long carbon-based molecules that string out, okay? You can form rings. And the other nice thing about carbon compounds is they tend to dissolve readily in water. And so that's good for life too, all right? There are millions and millions of possible compounds with carbon as the base. Now, sometimes you'll hear the word organic chemistry or organic compounds. That just means carbon-based. Okay? So when a chemist talks, uses the word organic, they just mean it's got carbon as the basis. Okay, so there is no, like all food is organic food, right? Inorganic food would be like eating a metal or something, right? So it's only sort of carbon that makes something, organic. So these carbon-based molecules are like the major molecules that allow life to happen. Okay, so you have carbohydrates. Okay, a carbohydrate is something that's basically made of carbon plus the atoms that make water. So carbohydrate. For example, anything that's like C, some combination of carbons plus a water molecule of some combination is a carbohydrate. These carbohydrates store and transport energy, so they're like glucose, the one that we were showing before, is an example of a carbohydrate. They store energy. When you break them apart, they release that chemical energy. Okay? They also provide structural components to plants and that kind of thing. There's another kind of basic things that you can make out of carbon atoms, which is called a lipid. And a lipid is something that repels or attracts water. It can also store and transport energy, and it's also the thing that tends to make a cell membrane, like a fat. Okay, so the membranes of cells are made out of sort of carbon-based lipids that keep the cell separate from other stuff. So again, all this stuff is carbon, and carbon is the fundamental thing that life uses to build all of its structures around. Proteins are another very important thing in cell function. They're long chains of so-called amino acids. And proteins do this, I'll talk a bit more about examples of proteins. But proteins play a very fundamental role in life, and they allow a lot of complex things to happen in life. What are these amino acids? They are things with an amino group, okay, that can be tagged on in this way with carbon as the basis as the basic element. Interestingly, all life on Earth uses only 22 amino acids, even though there are 70 plus known possible amino acids. Okay, so these basic amino acids are a fundamental building block of the proteins that allow life to do its thing. And even though there are many, many of them that could exist, there are sort of 22 select amino acids that all life on Earth utilizes. Only 20 of them are really very common, and 2 of them are only known in very, very rare circumstances in life, sort of very extreme, kind of weird stuff. The other thing that's kind of crazy is, you can imagine constructing this thing so that it's situated either a left-handed way or a right-handed way. So depending on how the molecules kind of stick out from the other side and bind to each other, you can imagine building it one way or building it another way. And biologists tend to call this left-handed amino acid versus right-handed amino acid. There's no sort of chemical reason why you shouldn't have both left and right-handed amino acids. And in fact, we see them in space, we see them all over the place. But all life on Earth basically uses only the left-handed form. Okay? So I'm not going to test you over this or whatever, but these are the 22 amino acids found in all life on Earth. The vast majority of them are left-handed. They don't have to be. So again, that suggests that all life on Earth probably arose from some very basic, some initial set that for one reason or another started using the left-handed version of these amino acids and not the right-handed version of these amino acids. Now, what do we mean by left-handed versus right-handed? Imagine you had some kind of complex amino acid that had some spatial structure. You could build it this way, or you could build it this way, and they're in fact not the same way. Like one is, you can't just take this thing and like turn it this way and look at it from a different angle and make this one. The only way you could get something that looked like this is to put it up against a mirror. So it's like a mirror symmetry. And just for purposes of bookkeeping, these are the ones that people call left-handed. Okay, it's my left hand. Stick it this way. These are the ones that we call right-handed. And for some reason, biological systems on Earth only use these, even though there are lots of these that could exist and do exist in nature. But biology only uses these on Earth. So another thing that people talk about is, well, if we ever discovered life on another planet, maybe it would be based on the right-handed amino acids, or maybe it would be based on both. Doesn't have to be. Just left-handed. Okay. I'm going to quickly just mention this. We're going to return to DNA and RNA later. But nucleic acids are the basis for the storage and transmission of hereditary information in all cells. So if you recall, what is life? One of the fundamental things that life has to do is pass on hereditary traits. And then that these hereditary traits are the things that are fundamentally driving evolution, or one of the main components that allow evolution to act as a force and allow these other sort of, allow life to sort of progress over time and diversify over time. DNA is the stuff that encodes structural information for making new proteins in RNA, okay? And RNA is the thing that determines how a cell functions. It tells cells how to manufacture new proteins and enzymes. So you can think of DNA as kind of the operating instructions for the cell, and RNA is the stuff that actually carries out the instructions. And we'll return to this later, but the basic point is these long, huge RNA and DNA molecules are fundamentally carbon-based. They're built out of these amino acids, this select few of amino acids that allow life on Earth to exist. Okay. It's just another version. I'll return to how the encoding happens in another lecture. So the sum point here, we first started to talk about oxygen, right? And I sort of I started off talking about oxygen by sort of saying, look, the rise of oxygen and the history of oxygen in the atmosphere on Earth has been fundamental in that effectively it drove, or it spurred on, this ability to build ever more complicated life forms. And the occurrence of complicated life forms on Earth appear to sort of coincide with these sort of the rise of oxygen in one way or another. And really importantly, animal life is only allowed because we have this rich oxygen atmosphere. We breathe in this oxygen that allows us to use our food effectively to make energy. And that's what allows animals to be so cool, right? So much more interesting, I would think, than plants. Okay, personal opinion. But if you look out and you think about, okay, how did this happen? Okay, how did nature figure out how to capture this solar energy, these other types of energy, make use of this oxygen, and then utilize this energy to do stuff? It had to build kind of complicated little mini biological machines or chemical machines that captured this energy via ADP, ATP cycle. Okay. All life on Earth uses this same cycle. So this suggests that at some point, evolution figured out how to do this, and everybody else has been cheating off that same idea. Okay? They've just been using that same idea to build ever more complicated things. If you go to even more base level, right, all life on Earth uses roughly only 20 left-handed amino acids, even though there are many other types of amino acids. And again, it suggests there's sort of this base group of stuff that began to be utilized for life everywhere. All life uses DNA. I'll talk about this next time. All life uses DNA to encode and store hereditary information and that facilitates sort of the power of evolution to drive diversity and then change species over time. Okay. So what suggests here is all evidence points to an as yet unidentified universal common ancestor for all life on Earth that arose at some point in the distant past. And next time we'll talk about the origin of life on Earth, where that may have came from, and then how it gave rise to the complexity we see. All right, thanks.